Story 1. This happened in 2021, when I was 21 years old. At the time, I was staying at my parents' house for summer break and thought I should go camping in the forest behind their place, while I still had the chance. It was completely a spur-of-the-moment decision. That morning, I simply packed my stuff into a backpack and left that very night. I had done this plenty of times before, so this trip didn't feel like anything unusual. I told my parents where I was going, then left around 4 p.m. to find a spot to spend the night. After about an hour of walking, I found a nice little clearing. I set up my tent, cleared some space, and started a small campfire. The atmosphere was cozy, and with the sun slowly setting, everything felt perfect. It was exactly the kind of night I was hoping for. But it didn't last long before it was broken. The sun had just touched the treetops when I heard a voice, a man's voice, mumbling or saying something. It even sounded like it was echoing, which made it hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. Darkness was starting to settle in, and the shadows of the trees made it even harder to see. I should add, the forest behind my parents' house is quite large and hardly explored. There are no trails out there, so running into someone would be very rare. I thought maybe it was just someone passing by, and it would stop soon. But the voice kept going for almost 5 minutes. Long enough for me to realize that whoever it was wasn't just passing, but deliberately hanging around near me. Finally, I shouted out, simply yelling, "Hello," to see if anyone would respond. But before I could even finish the word, the voice stopped instantly. The entire forest went deathly silent. I started to feel uneasy, so I called out again. Still no answer. At that point, I was really creeped out. With only about 20-30 minutes of weak daylight left, I decided I should move. There was no reason to sit there all night being paranoid, letting it ruin my trip. So, within minutes, I packed up my stuff and headed deeper into the forest to find another spot. But I wasn't so lucky. After 15 minutes, the daylight was almost completely gone, and I was forced to pick a random spot among the trees to set up camp. Thankfully, I did, because by the time I finished setting up, it was pitch black. The sun was gone, and the woods were silent. I started to feel calm again, thinking that I made a few s'mores and sat by the fire for hours. When it got pretty late, I started letting the fire die down. It was still lit, but only about half as bright as before. That's when I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching behind me. It seemed to come from my left, just over my shoulder. But it was so dark, and when I looked that way, the noise stopped. I called out again. Honestly, I didn't expect anything this time either. But just a few seconds later, a man stepped out from the darkness of the woods into the glow of the fire. What startled me most was that he came from a different direction, not from where the sound had been. "Didn't mean to scare you," he smiled, walking up and sitting down by the fire. He held out his hands to warm them, as if this was completely normal, like he knew me or had some right to be there. I awkwardly said, "Can I help you? I think you've got the wrong campsite." He only replied, "No." I didn't know what he was denying, my question or something else. Either way, the answer was deeply unsettling. It took me a few seconds to figure out what to say or do. So there was this strange, tense silence between us, both of us sitting by the fire without a word. The silence became so unbearable that I blurted out something I wish I hadn't. "Were you the one I heard talking in the woods earlier, near my first campsite?" The man kept staring at the fire, but his face immediately shifted, turning expressionless. "Must have been someone else," he replied, voice low, cold, and flat. Everything felt so wrong at that moment, but I still didn't know how to get out without making things worse. Before I could think further, I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned. The sound had come from the exact same spot on the left side of the camp. My heart sank. This man was not alone. Someone else was out there. I turned back to the fire. He was staring straight at me. Honestly, I can't even remember if he looked angry, smiling, or blank. All I remember was the cold, dead look in his eyes cutting right into me. Instantly, I shot up from my seat and sprinted into the woods. I heard one of them shout something, clearly at the other in an annoyed tone, then the sound of footsteps chasing me. But as I ran deeper into the dark forest, I managed to lose them. Since I had grown up in these woods, basically my backyard, I was able to find my way to the main road and ran straight to my parents' house. My parents called 911 for me. Long story short, the next morning I took the police to the campsite, but everything was gone. I don't know if that was better or worse. On one hand, maybe they only wanted to steal something, but on the other, it also showed they had truly bad intentions, meaning they could have done anything. After all, one of them did chase me. Needless to say, I never went back into the forest behind my parents' house again. Story 2. I used to travel a lot for work. I often rented Airbnbs because they were convenient and reasonably priced. It was summer at the time, and as someone who loved hiking and camping, I had heard from friends that there were old fire lookout towers you could rent for overnight stays. They used to be observation posts, now decommissioned, usually sitting in complete isolation deep in the forest. I chose one of the most remote ones I could find. It was surprisingly easy to book, with plenty of availability through the summer. And since I loved long hikes anyway, it seemed perfect. But the only thing I could find was one old, blurry photo of the place. I really had no idea what the tower actually looked like. All I knew was that it had been built back in the 1950s, so it had to be very old. Whether it had been repaired much or not, I had no clue. I packed my usual camping gear and started my hike around 9 in the morning. The trail at first wasn't particularly scenic, just dense forest and rough terrain. The path was barely there anymore, just a faint, uneven track. After 5 hours of hiking, I finally saw the fire tower in the distance. It sat atop a ridge, looking quite small. Not one of those tall towers on stilts, but more like a little wooden cabin, only about 10 to 12 feet high. It still took me another hour to climb up to it. But the effort was worth it. The view from up there stretched out like the whole world was at my feet. Still, the tower was clearly in bad shape, aged, patched here and there in a rough way. It had an outdoor spiral staircase of about 20 steps that led to a wooden walkway wrapping around it. Inside, it was completely empty. Nothing luxurious, but not terrible either. With that view, I felt it was more than enough. With several hours of daylight left, I set my backpack down, made some food, and rested on the balcony. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of wind and birds. After such a long, exhausting hike, when the sun went down, I spread out my sleeping bag on the wooden floor and laid down. It was only about 8 p.m. Even though I was tired, I couldn't fall asleep right away. I think maybe 30 to 40 minutes passed before I suddenly heard noises outside the tower. Before I could sit up, I distinctly heard footsteps. Seconds later, a man appeared at the top of the staircase. He looked to be in his 40s with shoulder-length blonde hair. The strange part was that when he saw me, he didn't look surprised at all, almost like he already knew I'd be there. "This is a great place to spend a few nights, isn't it?" he said with a smile, stepping closer to me. I nodded, uneasy, and told him I'd booked the place for the next 3 nights. I was already starting to feel uncomfortable, because I knew how isolated this place was. For him to appear here while I was also here felt bizarre. I asked if he was camping nearby. "Actually, I was planning on staying here tonight," he said with another smile. I didn't know how to respond. Eventually, I just apologized. He continued, "Well, looks like you've got plenty of space. I mean, you're here alone, right?" I hesitated, then lied, saying a friend of mine would be arriving in a few minutes, and unfortunately, we couldn't let him stay. The smile slowly faded from his face. He stood silently for a moment, then nodded and turned to leave. It wasn't until he walked down the stairs that I realized he wasn't carrying a backpack or any gear at all. He must have stashed it somewhere nearby. I couldn't understand why someone would hike so deep into the wilderness with no camping gear, even if they intended to use the tower. That thought unsettled me, so I stayed up for a while longer, looking down into the forest below. But eventually, I grew too tired and finally crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off. The next morning, I woke up feeling better, spent the first hour making coffee and enjoying the view. But when I stepped down from the tower, I noticed a piece of paper pinned to the wooden railing at the bottom of the stairs. It was just a scrap of paper with the word "sorry" written on it, with a smiley face. I knew it had to be from the man last night, which meant he had come back during the night while I was asleep just to leave that note. The thought chilled me. The fact that he left such a message was downright creepy. Either way, I decided to go for a hike, partly to check out the area, see if he was still lurking nearby, because clearly he hadn't left the way he should have. I walked into the woods at the base of the tower, but found nothing. It was the same dense forest as the day before. No trace of a campsite or belongings. I went back to the tower and tried to enjoy the silence for the rest of the day. That night, I stayed up much later than before. I had a small battery lantern, which I hung on the wall so I could see better. I just sat there, letting my thoughts wander, occasionally looking out at the dark. I reached the tree line, but just as I did, I saw something move ahead of me. Just for a second, a shadow slipping out of the weak glow of my lantern. I froze for a moment, then raised the lantern higher, but it didn't help much. I called out, "Is someone there?" The silence that followed made the air even more chilling. I nearly ran straight back to the tower, but once inside, it didn't feel much safer. The walls were all windows, and like I said, the door had no lock. A part of me wanted badly to leave, but walking out into the pitch-black wilderness on a nearly vanished trail seemed worse. I hung the lantern back on the wall and stared into the forest below. The terrifying part was knowing that from out there, if someone was watching, they could clearly see me standing in the lit-up window. while I could only see darkness. I kept my eyes on the stairs, waiting for someone to come up. The longer I stared, the more my unease grew. I didn't know what to do, but I decided to pack my things. At least if something happened, I'd be ready to leave. As I stuffed things into my backpack, every 30 seconds or so I would stop and look back out the window. I kept packing, glancing out, packing, glancing out, over and over, until finally everything was in my pack and I was ready to go. I set it against the wall, turned back to the window, and there was a man standing at the base of the stairs. He stood right at the first step, staring up as if he were just waiting. Through the railing, I could only see part of his body, but I was sure it was the same man from yesterday. No backpack, tall frame, exactly the same build. Terror flooded me. Why had he come back? And why was he just standing there, motionless beneath the stairs? What if he decided to climb up again? My mind was spinning. I stared at him through the window for 2 full minutes before he finally moved. He stepped back a few paces, paused, then walked away. But the direction he took quickly disappeared from my sight, blocked by the tower. If he really walked back into the forest, it was too dark for me to tell. In that moment, I felt sure he was stalking me. Or at the very least, watching me, waiting, inching closer in the dead of night. Maybe it was instinct, but I knew if I stayed any longer, something terrible was going to happen. I waited a few minutes, grabbed my pack, and quietly descended the stairs, stepping onto the ground below. I can't describe the tension of leaving the town. Only when the sun rose did I finally breathe easier, completing the trail and leaving the forest. I don't think I can fully describe the horror of those nights. My instincts told me that man had very bad intentions. And what still haunts me is this. I had told him I booked the tower for 3 nights. Which means there was absolutely no reason for him to come back again and again just to check if I was still there. Story 3. That also meant he thought I would be staying for the 3rd night. So if I hadn't left early and had actually stayed for that final night, things could have taken a much more horrifying turn. A few years ago, I was driving along the Alaska Highway. I had converted my SUV into a camper and spent 2 months on the road, sleeping in the vehicle as I traveled. The main goal of the trip was to drive the Alaska Highway itself. The road is famous for a reason. It stretches across Western Canada, extremely remote and rugged. I knew this in advance, so I prepared as thoroughly as possible for the journey. But there was one thing that made me feel especially uneasy. Since I had to drive through Canada, I couldn't bring a firearm. Normally, I always kept one under the seat just in case of emergencies. But this time, it wasn't an option. Anyway, the first day went smoothly. I drove for about 8 hours. The early part of the highway wasn't too desolate, but further along, gas stations appeared only every few hundred miles. That meant I had to stop and fill up every chance I got, driving carefully the whole way. By sunset, I was exhausted. I pulled off into a roadside camping area. The highway has occasional rest stops, but also many little trails that lead into secluded forest campsites. I always preferred those more hidden spots. But since it was already dark, I couldn't see much of where I had stopped. All I knew was that I was surrounded by forest and there was no one else around. I put up the window covers, crawled into the back seat, and slept straight through until morning. Everything seemed fine. I slept well and never woke once during the night. Before hitting the road again, I decided to stretch and take a short walk. As soon as I stepped outside, I noticed a trail, so I followed it. It wasn't long, maybe 5 minutes of walking, when I came across another campsite. But something was off. It looked messy, disturbed. Clearly, someone had been there recently, but it seemed they had left in a hurry. Half of their belongings were gone. And between the strange campsite and this sudden truck appearing in the middle of a desolate forest road, I didn't hesitate. I got in my SUV and drove off immediately. I didn't care whether there was a logical explanation or not. Getting away was the only choice. I drove 3 or 4 hours straight before reaching a gas station. It was very old, with just a single 2-sided pump. Nobody else was there. I stepped out and began refueling. The view was breathtaking, mountains in every direction, so I didn't mind waiting while the slow pump filled my tank. But just a few minutes later, I saw a truck approaching along the road. As it drew closer, I was almost certain it was the same black pickup I had seen back at the campsite. My stomach dropped when it pulled into the gas station and stopped on the opposite side of the pump. Of course, logically, that made sense. Everyone traveling this highway had to stop for gas eventually, but the timing still felt unsettling. Why had they pulled into the forest campsite, stayed only minutes, then left right after me? Luckily, my tank filled just in time. Within 30 seconds, I was back in my SUV driving away quickly. What made it creepier was that I had still never seen the driver. He never got out, never revealed himself. That alone made the whole thing far more suspicious. Still, I felt safer with a full tank. I could drive for hours without stopping, put distance between us, and maybe find a campsite in daylight instead of being forced to stop after dark again. I kept driving for a long stretch until the sun started setting. Finally, I found a decent spot to stop. This one felt better hidden, down a small path tucked into dense brush with no signs of recent use. Definitely not a common camping area. I felt safer there. Honestly, I wanted to set up a tent and enjoy a proper night of camping out in the open. The space was so much larger than cramming into the back of the SUV. But something in my gut told me not to risk it, just in case. So I cooked a meal outside, enjoyed the scenery until dark, and then climbed back inside my vehicle. The next day's drive would hopefully be shorter than the previous 2. With that in mind, I decided to stay up late watching some videos I had downloaded on my phone. I stayed awake for about 4 hours, feeling pretty relaxed, excited even, knowing that by the next morning, I would finally reach Alaska. But then, around 11 p.m., I heard noises outside my vehicle, and within 1 second of listening, I knew it was footsteps. The sound of dry branches and leaves crunching underfoot, unmistakable. I quickly put my phone down and sat upright, staring at the window, but it was already too late. A man's face suddenly pressed against the side window, staring directly at me. The sight froze me instantly. I couldn't make out every detail, but I knew exactly what I saw. I gasped and stumbled backward, my body locking up with terror. The man pulled away, disappearing into the pitch-black darkness just outside. I scrambled into the front seat, only to see another figure, the one whose footsteps I had heard earlier, running toward the SUV. He smashed the rear window just as I lunged into the driver's seat. The adrenaline was overwhelming. I could barely manage the simple act of finding the keys and starting the engine. As I fumbled, I glanced back. One man was rushing the driver's side window, while the other reached through the broken glass, trying to unlock the door from the inside. In a panic, I somehow got the key in, turned it, and the engine roared to life at the exact moment the rear door swung open. I slammed my foot on the gas. As the SUV lurched forward, I caught sight of that familiar black pickup parked off the side of the road, hidden behind some trees. They had been following me all along. I drove about a mile before pulling over briefly to slam the rear door shut and call the police with what little cell service I could get. Of course, the call dragged on forever, cutting in and out, and by then, the two men were long gone. I never got a license plate, never saw their faces clearly. It was hopeless. Despite the nightmare, I eventually made it to Alaska after repairing the broken glass and managed to enjoy the rest of my trip. But what those men intended to do, breaking into my vehicle in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, knowing full well I was inside, that's something I can only guess at. And honestly, I'd rather not think about it anymore.